All right, guys, we're going to start with some lit theory today. I know you're pretty psyched. Make sure you have your note page out for this because you're going to want to have it all year long. Literary theory is actually really fun. It's one of my favorite things to do. I used to teach this about halfway through the year, but what I'm trying this year is right off the bat because I think it is going to help you, get a handle on meanings of works. Just give you a different way to figure out what a work means. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. So here we go. Overview. Literary theory is like using a lens to look at a text. If we had a blue lens and we looked at the world through our blue lens, suddenly everything's going to look blue. If we switch to yellow, then suddenly everything's going to look yellow or have an overview of yellow, even though we're looking at the exact same thing. And that is what a literary theory does. It gives us a lens through which to examine a text. Now, there's no one theory better than another, but you're probably going to find that you lean towards one or the other because it just aligns with how you see the world. All right. So today we're going to talk about 6 theories: formalist, archetypal, social class, gender, psychological, and historical biographical. For each theory, I'm going to talk to you, just give you an overview of the assumptions that critics of using this theory assume, and what strategies we can use when we apply that theory to a text, when we're looking at a text through that lens. All right, I will also tell you that historical and biographical are technically 2 different theories, but we're going to group them together, and you'll see why when we get to that point. All right, so our first theory today is formalist. The assumptions that a formalist critic takes is that we should focus on the work itself and not worry too much about what the author intended or how we feel about it or what it makes us feel. So we won't be answering questions like, how did this make you feel? How does it relate to your life? That's not what it's about. All right, formalist theory says that if you want to find the meaning of a work, you got to pay attention to the form of the work and to varying conventions. So the meaning of the work is contained within itself. So you can look at a poem and figure out what it means without knowing the historical background or who the author was or anything like that. All right, so let's look at some strategies. First one, read closely. Each detail of the work contributes to its meaning. Analyze things like diction, patterns, point of view, symbols, motifs, etc. And then consider how every component of the text works to unify it and create meaning. Okay, so let's see here. Here we go. That beeping was my lunch being done, so I had to go turn off the oven. All right, so here we go. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it's what you've been doing for 11 years in English class. Looking at word choice, looking at motifs, looking at first person versus third person. Have you ever done anything that looks like this? I bet you did for your summer assignment, hopefully. All right, if you have ever done anything like this, where you're marking up what words mean, then you are already practicing formalist criticism. And just so you know, this is primarily what the AP exam requires. So, there you go. All right, had to go eat my lunch, and now we're back. Our next theory is archetypal theory. And the underlying assumptions about archetypal theory and archetypes, you know that word, is that all humans have a collective unconscious, basically kind of this universal mind that we all share. And our collective unconscious can be seen in recurring themes and images found in dreams and myth. That's why so many cultures have stories about witches or dragons or what have you. All right. Recurring myths, symbols, and character types appear and reappear in literary works. For example, what kinds of types are there? There's the evil stepmother. There's the damsel in distress. You know these. All right. So our strategies for archetypal theory is that we first want to consider the genre of the work. This is what we're doing when we look at tragedy. What does tragedy mean? And how does it affect our meaning? We're also going to look for story patterns and symbolic associations. These can be colors, these can be like spring means renewal, winter means death, that kind of stuff. And then consider how we associate those symbols with meanings. Okay, so just like I said, springtime, why do we think of springtime as renewal? You know this kind of theory. You've just maybe never had a name for it before. I bet that most of you at some point have watched The Lion King during English class, maybe freshman year, or Star Wars. And you probably had some kind of chart where you were looking for certain kinds of archetypes. That is exactly what an archetypal critic does, is they look through that archetypal lens just like you did when you watched that movie. All right, now we're getting to the big hitters. Social class theory. Sometimes it'll be called Marxist theory, and sometimes I'll slip up and call it Marxist theory because it's based on socialist theories of Karl Marx. But there's more to it than that. It's not just about being a socialist or a communist or whatever. All right, the assumptions underlying this theory is that the way people think and behave in any society is determined by basic economic factors. So do they have money or not? Or are they in power or not? Those groups of people who have and control wealth can exploit the rest of us through employment, through the fact that they have things that we need, and they can therefore force their own values and beliefs onto those who don't have things. So strategies that we use when we look at a text with this theory. First of all, we look at the effects of power that is based on economic factors or social class. That's my dog drinking in the background, by the way, if you can hear that. All right. Another thing we do is we examine how different social groups are portrayed in the text and what happens to them. Do all the rich people win and the poor people die? Do the poor people rise up against the rich people and win? What kinds of things are we looking at there? And last but not least, we analyze what kinds of power operate in the text. So when you read a text with this lens, we're thinking about who has power and who doesn't. Where does the power come from? Is it because they own land? Is it because they own the factories? Is it because they inherited money? And then those people who have power, are they kind and benevolent and generous, or are they horrible people, basically? So that's social class theory. All right, gender theory, we're going to try and call gender theory. It's sometimes called feminist theory because it looks at the role of women, but we need to expand that and look at the role of women and men and how they relate to each other. So the assumptions under this theory is that concepts of gender are cultural constructs. What I mean by that is we are all born with a certain sex. We're either born male or female. That doesn't, we have the parts for that. That doesn't actually mean that being a male entails getting a job, being the head of the household, or whatever. That is something that our society has created. And that's why, there was a revolution in the 1900s about women getting jobs that was going against the accepted construct of what it meant to be a woman. Okay? And because Western society is pervasively patriarchal, meaning run by men, we need to look at how that has affected literature. All right, in the production of literature and in the stories themselves, men and women have not had equal access. So first of all, women have not always had equal access to the opportunity to write and express themselves. Back in the 1800s, women often had to go under male pen names, for example. But men have always been able to express themselves. Also, what women were able to express and what not. And then how does that play out in the stories themselves? What do women not have access to that men do have access to, etc.? All right. Basically, men and women are different. They write differently, they read differently, and they write about their reading differently. And so we need to value these differences and see what we can learn from the differences instead of, blaming each other for things. That's why I don't like to call it feminist theory. Feminist seems a little too feminazi for me. So, all right. So the strategies. First of all, consider the gender of the author or the characters, and what role does gender or their sexuality play in the work. Next, look at how gender or sexual stereotypes might be reinforced or undermined. And then we're going to look at how work reflects or distorts the place of women and men in society. For example, are women in the end told to stay in their place or not? Are men told to be men or not? Last but not least, we're going to look at the effects of the power drawn from gender. So, it's how it is that men have typically been in control in Western society. And so what kinds of power do they have over the women who are not in control? All right. Psychological theory. Sometimes it'll be called Freudian theory because it often relies on the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud. But we're really looking at psychology in a literary text. Okay, this one is actually pretty complex, and I can't give you a whole semester's worth of psychology. Those of you who've had psychology will probably be a little ahead of the game, ahead of some of us, but we're going to kind of play around with it. So some of the basic assumptions are that human behavior is motivated by unconscious forces over which we have little or no control. Like sometimes we may do things and not really realize the true why we do it. Okay, and then of course Freud is all about repression and that we all have repressed desires and fears, things that we can't let out for whatever reason. And Freud maintained that when someone writes creatively, what they are doing is they are taking those unexpressed, repressed desires and fears and shaping them into something that is acceptable in a literary text. So that's something we can look for as we read those literary texts. And last, literary texts therefore reveal the complexities of human psychology, meaning they're written by a human being, they're about human beings, and therefore when we read them, we can learn about human beings. Strategies. Look at why characters do things. What are their motivations? What are their explicit motivations? What do they say versus what might be under the surface? Why might they really be doing something? All right, so then examine how repressed desires or fears may be encoded in the text through motifs, symbols, imagery, etc. And we're going to talk about this more in class, and I'm going to give you some examples. So if you don't really know what I'm talking about there, don't stress. No reason. All right, our last theory, it's actually two theories, but I'm going to lump them together and I'll tell you why here in a second. The assumptions are that the events and circumstances of authors' lives and historical time periods are reflected in the literary works they create. The meaning of a work should be based on the context of the work, either the author's life or the historical time period. So the strategy is to research a historical time period or the author's life in Biographical, then examine how that influences the text. And I bet most of you have had a teacher where they give you kind of a long PowerPoint about the history of a time period before you read the work. Or you do a little study of the author before you read that work. That is what they are doing is historical or biographical criticism. I'm telling you why we're lumping them together and why it's a pretty short little box in your notes is because I don't really practice this. I think there's validity, but I think that it also can tell students that you can't really know what something means unless you know all about a historical time period or an author. And I just think that's wrong. I think there are things to be gotten out of a work without that. All right. We won't use this very often, but I want you to know what it is and that it's out there, because if you're a history buff, by all means, do this. All right, so we're almost finished here. And since you've done your homework and watched this very first video of the year, you get to see a photo of my dog, Angus. There he is, looking happy down at the park by the plaza. And you get to know that there will probably be a quiz on Monday over this material. My dog's name, Angus, will be extra credit on the quiz. Now, here's my thing about this kind of thing. I know that some of you might just give your notes to your friend and tell them the extra credit, but why would you do that? Like, seriously, if they didn't do their homework, why would you give away what you've earned? If you earn a paycheck at your job, you don't just hand it over to someone else because they want it, but they didn't put in the time to do the work. It's the same thing for this. Why should they get the same bonus as you for not doing their homework? You put in the time, but that's your decision. All right, so this is the end of our introduction to literary theory. I'll see you on Monday, and get ready to have some fun with this.